Thanks to Edwin Moser. Thanks to my personal assistant on this trip, Dr. Ariadne Luya. Thanks to Margaret and Diana for making this happen. Thanks to PANSwiss, and especially thanks to each of you for making the trip and taking the time and effort to show up tonight. I'm going to talk about abrupt climate change. You're probably all familiar with anthropogenic climate change. We've heard a lot about that over the last decade or so. And we haven't heard much about abrupt climate change. It's a completely different phenomenon than the linear, relatively slow rate of change that is commonly reported in the media. This is a different thing. What I'm going to talk about is the equivalent of the asteroid. If there's an asteroid coming at Earth, and we know with certainty that it's going to remove all habitat for humans on Earth, do you want to know? I want to know. And because I'm a left-brain, hardcore science guy, I want to go, and not only do I want to know, but I want to tell everybody I know. If you don't want to know, if you just want to live out your life in great happiness instead of abject misery, which is what I spread around, then you might want to head for the exit at this point. At least you've been warned. My whole message can be illustrated in a 50-second clip from a commercial of all things. Any questions? That's really pretty much my whole message. And when I tell people that, they think it's a joke. It's weird when you're a public speaker and people laugh at all the wrong times. No, really, life is short. I think I would add the tagline, live more, instead of play more, but that's just me. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is perhaps the most conservative scientific body on the planet. They rely on information that is at least 5 years old for their assessments. The assessments are conducted by consensus among the scientists, and then the assessment is vetted through the political process before it's released to the public. In their latest assessment, officially released last year but heavily leaked beginning in September of the year before, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that global warming is irreversible in the absence of massive geoengineering of the Earth's atmosphere. That sounds problematic to me, and Truthout later headlined an article referring to that approach as fantasy technology. In fact, a handful of journal articles have come out since the report was leaked in September 2013, indicating that the known strategies for geoengineering are likely to not only not improve the situation, but actually might make it far worse. In addition, the most commonly proposed of those approaches, called solar radiation management, or putting particulates into the stratosphere to reflect incoming sunlight, would have to be maintained forever. Forever is a long time, especially toward the end. So I can't imagine us sustaining this set of living arrangements for much longer, much less maintaining a project such as solar radiation management forever. The rapidity with which our lives are complete applies not only to us as individuals, but to us as a species. I would have labeled this the history of humans, but that's just because of my politically correct academic experience. We'll go with, so as to not mess with the cartoonist's literary right, the history of man. So this is where we are, this is where humans are. We show up, we look around, wonder what the hell is happening, and then the end. That was so fast. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. 13.8 billion years. If we represent that 13.8 billion years with my arm span, then the human experience, our species, say Homo sapiens, represents the last few cells at the end of my middle finger. That's it. We just showed up from an astronomical perspective, and yet we think it's all about us, right? I mean, most people I know, afflicted by the arrogance of humanism, assume that the whole thing is about us. We're one among millions of species. We're each one among billions of individuals. I'm going to consider the idea of human extinction as a result of abrupt climate change, which is indicated as a different phenomenon than relatively slow, ongoing, linear climate change. We've had no members of the genus Homo on the planet. During the 2.8 million years of the genus Homo, the temperature has never been 3.3 degrees or more above baseline. Baseline meaning the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, about 1750, when we really started burning fossil fuels at a large scale. Up until that point, there's a little bit of coal here in this community and a little bit of oil in that community, but in 1750, we really started the show, known as industrial civilization. During that time, there was a period during what's called the Eemian epoch, and the global average temperature rose to about 3.2 degrees above baseline in the span of thousands of years. We're headed for a higher temperature than that in a very short period of time. We're headed for more than 3.5 degrees above baseline in the near future, a third of a degree higher than that experienced by the genus Homo, and the rapidity of the change is problematic. Let's consider, for example, sorry for the goofy cartoonish slide, but I'm a goofy cartoonish guy, so it seems to fit me. Earth has never experienced this 3.5 degrees, even 3.3 degrees above baseline in the past. Let's think about that for a minute. Quote, normal body temperature for humans is 36.6 degrees. We add 3.5 to that, that's up over 40. You don't survive that. In a matter of days, at a body temperature above 40 degrees, you die. We're headed for a body temperature in excess of what humans have experienced in the past in a very rapid period of time. Human extinction will result from loss of habitat, not because we're not clever. We're very, very clever. We have lights that come on at the flip of a switch. We have water that comes out of the tap at the flip of a lever. We have the ability to transport ourselves great distances in short periods of time. So we have this amazing capacity for cleverness. You've heard the expression, too clever by half. Maybe that's us. Maybe we should have called ourselves Homo calidus, the clever ape, instead of Homo sapiens, the wise ape. In any event, we're very clever. That's not the issue. What's at issue here is that we are human animals, and like every other animal, like every other plant, we require habitat to survive. And that habitat must include food, water, clean air, and of course the ability to maintain our own body temperature as well. Global warming is already outpacing evolution by natural selection by 10,000 times. Already at the relatively slow, sort of linear rate of change we've experienced so far at 0.85 degrees above baseline, a little less than 1 degree above the baseline temperature. Already, global warming is outstripping the ability of plants and native animals to keep up by a factor of 10,000 times. This is absolutely huge and massively underreported in the media, for example. How quickly could humans all disappear from the planet? I'm going to try to bracket here how quickly and how long it could be until humans go extinct. At the low end, it appears to me that collapse of industrial civilization could occur this year. I'm not making any prediction here. I'm just saying that it could. It could occur this year. If you've looked at the derivatives market lately and compared it with where we were when Lehman Brothers collapsed, when AIG collapsed in late 2008, then you might reach the conclusion that that alone could cause the credit markets to seize up and terminate industrial civilization. According to David Korowicz, writing for the FOSTA Group in summer 2012, a disruption in the supply chain of anything significant could lead to the collapse of industrial civilization in as little as 3 weeks. What's significant? Well, I already mentioned the credit markets. If credit dries up, tankers are no longer going to deliver anything. If the food supply is disrupted because, for example, the Mississippi River becomes so low, the flow becomes so low that the grains can't be transported down and refined sugar-filled products can't be shipped up, then we have a disruption in the supply chain. Already, we have a disruption in the supply chain of water coming through the taps. Thousands of people in Northern California have been without water coming through the taps for more than 8 months. So it could be any number of factors that triggers the termination of the civilization that we are all familiar with, that we have come to know and most of us to love. When that happens, and I'm certain that it will happen, I'm just not predicting when. We can't sustain the unsustainable forever, obviously, and any set of living arrangements that depends upon ready access to cheap fossil fuels is, by definition, unsustainable. When that happens, the planet will experience a 1.2 plus or minus 0.2 degree temperature rise in a matter of days. This according to a paper by James Hansen and colleagues more than 3 years ago. 2 subsequent papers indicate the conservative nature of this paper, with the latter of them indicating that only about a 1/3 reduction in industrial activity causes a 1 degree temperature rise in a matter of days. Why in a matter of days? Industrial activity puts a lot of particulates into the atmosphere, most notably sulfates that are produced by burning coal. You've no doubt heard the expression clean coal. That's coal that doesn't have as much sulfate in it as dirty coal. So sulfates are what is produced when we burn high sulfur coal. And there are other reflective particles as well that are associated with burning fossil fuels that are kicked up into the atmosphere and that cause reflectance of the sun's rays in the troposphere and in the stratosphere before the sun's rays get down here where we live. So that umbrella produced, paradoxically enough, by industrial activity, will go away when the set of living arrangement ceases. Because this paper has been demonstrated to be conservative by 2 subsequent papers, I think it's safe to assume and to still remain conservative the idea of 1.4 degree temperature rise in a short period of time after the collapse of industrial civilization. One additional adverse side effect of the collapse of industrial civilization is the catastrophic meltdown of the world's 440-some nuclear power plants. And that's because if money is no longer worthwhile, then even first responders in an emergency respond only for a few days. After that, they go home to spend time to protect the ones they love. If money becomes worthless, if there's just a disruption in the supply chain leading to the collapse of industrial civilization so that people don't get paid anymore, it's difficult for me to imagine people voluntarily going to the nuclear power plants. It's difficult for me to imagine grid-tied electricity still being available. Both of those are required to keep this from happening. We need to be able to pay people and we need to have grid-tied electricity. Without both of those, in a few days, the cooling ponds are no longer filled with cool water. The water evaporates out because the spent fuel rods are hot. And then we have 1,200 ponds filled with spent fuel rods exposed to the atmosphere that will explode and spew ionizing radiation all over the globe. I don't want to focus on bad news because I'm such an optimist. So that's all I'm going to say about the nuclear power plants and their ability to all experience Fukushima-style meltdown in a short period of time. So now I'm going to focus more on climate change. If industrial civilization collapses this year, and perhaps even if it doesn't, we're headed for an open ocean in the Arctic in a short period of time. According to the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, an analysis conducted there several years ago, we could experience an ice-free Arctic in 2016. It could happen this year. We're on track each month of this year already. We've experienced the lowest Arctic ice level for that month in human history. So it could be we have open water in September of this year, regardless of whether industrial civilization collapses. And if that happens, it will lead to this. It will lead to the collapse of civilization, because this adds enough temperature, 1.3 degrees, global average, that it leads to the collapse of civilization because of the inability to grow grains in the place that grains are grown. The interior of large continents heats up at least twice as fast as the global average. So if we take the 0.85 C above baseline we're at right now, add the 1.3 degrees conservatively estimated to result from a 50 gigaton abrupt release of methane, that takes us up over 2 for the global average, which means up over 4 for the interior of large continents. And I can't imagine we'll be growing much corn, wheat, and soybeans when that happens. So it doesn't really matter which one comes first. Natalia Shukova, by the way, has done field work in the Arctic Ocean for about the last 10 years, and I would consider her a premier authority on what would be the initial release of methane from beneath the Arctic Ocean. Not the last of them, but the initial abrupt release. Already we see with this little video clip what happens over the course of the last few years, 1979 to 2014, we see what has happened with Arctic sea ice. Arctic sea ice starts at about 17,000 cubic kilometers in 1979. It's been declining since then. You see that there's recovery at some points. There will be collapse of the Arctic ice sheet, followed by a year or two of recovery. Here it comes, and then another decline, so that in 2012, the Arctic experienced its lowest ever ice cover. This year, each month so far, we have observed Arctic ice cover less than that observed in 2012. So there's been a recovery in 2013, 2014, but the general trend is catastrophically down. So if we tally up the 0.85 C above baseline we're at right now, the 1.4 conservatively added by the collapse of industrial civilization, and then add on the 1.3 conservatively estimated to result from the first 50 gigaton rapid release of methane, and that takes us to a third of a degree higher than that experienced by the genus Homo at any time in our 2.8 million year history, with more than 3/4 of that rise in temperature occurring in about a year or so. Already, remember, evolution by natural selection is outpaced by global warming by a factor of 10,000. I'm going to focus on one of many irreversible self-reinforcing feedback loops. And first, a little analogy. A self-reinforcing feedback loop is a phenomenon, a process that feeds upon itself. It's the snowball that gets started at the top of a steep hill, and the faster it goes down the hill, the more snow it accumulates on the way down, so the bigger it gets, and then the bigger it gets, the more rapidly it's able to take up snow, and so on. So it's self-reinforcing. I'm going to focus on one of several of these, initially reported in the journal literature in August 2009, that of release of methane from beneath the Arctic Ocean. Subsequently reported in several other sources that have great credentials. In fact, the scientific process is very conservative, so that it takes until September 2012, in a paper by Michael Jennings in Global Policy, to conclude that there are several of these self-reinforcing feedback loops and that they are irreversible. So it's years after the phenomenon is first reported before the conclusion is reached that there are several of them and that they are irreversible at temporal spans relevant to humans, at least. Now, in the past, there have been abrupt rises in global average temperature, stabilization over hundreds of thousands or millions of years, and then a sharp decline down to a new level. So we know that there are negative feedbacks, but we don't know almost anything about them. So we don't know what triggers those sudden cooling events. We know there's a handful of relatively stable states that Earth has experienced in the past, and that the changes from one state to another tend to be abrupt rather than slow. By July 2013, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration of the United States, with their CARVE project, reports that methane plumes up to 150 kilometers across are found in the Arctic Ocean. 150 kilometers is a long way. If you're in a sailing ship and you're in the middle of that plume, all you can see in every direction is what looks like boiling water as the methane is bubbling out of the Arctic Ocean. These observations were made with satellites, so they're direct observations, they're not models. So this is what atmospheric methane looks like over the relatively recent past. So starting in 1999, relatively stable levels of atmospheric methane. Starting in 2007, it looks like it starts to go exponential. And these are, again, reliable sources: the incredibly conservative Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, NOAA, the World Meteorological Organization, the Met Ops station in the UK, and so on. So Sam Carana extends this forward and says we're headed to hell approximately right here. So he alone, as nearly as I can tell amongst people who study this issue, projects runaway climate change, the likes of which will give us a planet with an atmosphere like that of Venus, incapable of supporting life for the long term. Perhaps we haven't triggered this, and we've instead triggered a rise to 5 or 6 or 11 or 12 degrees above where we're at now, which are a couple of the stable states that Earth has experienced in the past. In any event, somebody pointed out to me last night that this slide has been eclipsed by other data. This guy's sitting in the front row and he says, so apparently you're unable to keep up with the information? I'm like, wow, first insult right out of the box. And I said, well, I've been traveling for about a month, so I haven't been able to update my often updated essay, so I'm probably a little behind. He said, well, according to data from the first 3 months of 2015, we are at more than 2,000 parts per billion methane in the atmosphere, which on this graph is off the graph. So that's for 2015. So if in fact we've gone from here to here and we're off the graph, that indicates that we need to turn this thing a little bit more. Those are early observations based on only a few months so far. So I'm reminded yet again of the very common headline I read now: global warming is proceeding more rapidly than we thought. And fill in the blank on global warming with any part of the global warming phenomenon. Arctic ice disappearing. A few years ago, there's an article in the mainstream media that said the U.S. Naval Postgraduate College is predicting an ice-free Arctic by 2016, and the subtitle was 84 years ahead of schedule. And I'm like, wow, nature has a schedule. And we were apparently uninformed, or we got the wrong memo first. I see this kind of thing weekly now, that events are proceeding more rapidly than we ever thought possible, than we ever really imagined. That's the first of, so far, 47 self-reinforcing feedback loops that I know about, although somebody posted one on Facebook, and then 12 other people posted on Facebook, and then 27 people sent me email messages about one other one that I haven't had an opportunity to look into yet, that's been apparently triggered this year. So that was reported initially in 2009. There's an increased number of them through time. These include things, for example, such as peat moss in the world's boreal forests, which is essentially sublimating, going from solid form to gaseous form in a very rapid period of time. As it gets warmer and drier in the boreal forests, more of that peat is released as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which makes it warmer and drier. Arctic ice is disappearing, and that has consequences for methane coming up from the Arctic. Those two interact with each other. I'm sure you've heard about those large holes in Siberia. There are up over 20 of them now that are emblematic of rapid release of methane from the permafrost, or what we now call permamelt amongst the informed, because the permafrost is going away too. So there are many, many of these factors that have been triggered, and we only know by looking in the rearview mirror. And an analysis of one of them from an expert on Arctic methane, Paul Beckwith, who works at the University of Ottawa in Canada. He says that in late November of last year that abrupt climate change has been triggered and will cause a 5 to 6 degree temperature increase within 10 or 20 years. And Paul actually considered that instead of being a 5 or 6 degree rise, it might be an 11 or 12 degree rise from where we are right now, acknowledging that in paleoclimatic history, there have been those two relatively stable states, and that the transition from one state to another tends to occur quite quickly. Paul does not conclude near-term human extinction as a result of the temperature rising 5 or 6 C within 10 or 20 years, which is stunning to me until I consider his background. He's a laser physicist and engineer, and so I think he doesn't understand the concept of habitat. I'm reminded of a line from Farley Mowat, the writer. We're under some gross misconception that we're a good species going somewhere important, and that at the last minute we'll correct our errors and God will smile on us. It's delusion. It's not only delusion, but the last minute was years ago. I don't know if the last minute was 2007, when it appears atmospheric methane went exponential. I don't know if the last minute was 1939, when we started building nuclear power facilities. I don't know if the last minute was a few thousand years before that, or maybe a few hundred years before that with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Maybe it was a few thousand years before that when we began the project known as civilization at 7 locations around the globe, essentially simultaneously. I don't know if it was when we climbed out of the trees and started using fire, or maybe it was language that was the problem. In any event, it seems like the last minute was a long time ago. It appears to me we've come to a fork in the road a few million times as a species, and every time we've taken the wrong turn. So far, I'm an optimist, of course. We could yet take a right turn. I think it's too late to make any difference as far as our species is concerned, but not for the many other species which occupy the planet with us. Lest you think I'm the only crazy person in the room, ooh, that was insulting. Lest you think I'm the only crazy person on the planet, there are 14 men and 3 women I know about who have, in the public arena, also concluded that we're headed for a human extinction in the near term. These include biologists such as Frank Fenner and Neil Dawes, geoscientist Malcolm Light, anthropologist Louise Leakey and her anthropologist father Richard Leakey. Notice she was ahead of him by a few months this time. Public figure Sir Bob Geldof. I will be the first to admit that he's not a climate scientist, but he also probably has more influence than most people on the list because he's not a climate scientist. He's a public figure. Same for Noam Chomsky. And I should point out that all these people are smarter than me. Well down the list we see Aaron Sorkin, again, not a public figure, not a climate scientist, but somebody who writes scripts for television. So in the United States, way more important than anybody else on the list. In November of last year, Aaron Sorkin wrote a piece for the Newsroom about climate change, and it's a 4-minute clip that we're going to show right here.
And joining us now in studio is Richard Westbrook, Deputy Assistant Administrator of the EPA. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Westbrook, you've spent most of your professional career as a climate scientist in the public sector.
Yes, 10 years as a supervisory management analyst in the Office of Environmental Information. And before that, I was a program specialist in the EPA's Resource Management Division.
And you have a PhD in climate science from Stanford.
Yes, and another in chemistry with a master's in biology.
Okay. Tell us about the findings in the report that was just released.
The latest measurements taken at Mauna Loa in Hawaii indicate a CO2 level of 400 parts per million.
Just so we know what we're talking about, if you were a doctor and we were the patient, what's your prognosis? 1,000 years, 2,000 years?
A person has already been born who will die due to catastrophic failure of the planet.
What did he just say?
Okay, can you expand on that?
Sure. The last time there was this much CO2 in the air, the oceans were 80 feet higher than they are now. Two things you should know. Half the world's population lives within 120 miles of an ocean.
And the other?
Humans can't breathe underwater.
You're saying the situation's dire.
Not exactly. Your house is burning to the ground, the situation's dire. Your house has already burned to the ground. The situation's over.
So what can we do to reverse this?
Oh, there's a lot we could do.
Good.
If it were 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, but now, no.
Can you make an analogy that might help us understand?
Sure. It's as if you're sitting in your car, in your garage, with the engine running and the door closed, and you've slipped into unconsciousness, and that's it.
What if someone comes and opens the door?
You're already dead.
What if the person got there in time?
You'd be saved.
Okay. So now what's the CO2 equivalent of the getting there on time?
Shutting off the car 20 years ago.
You sound like you're saying it's hopeless.
Yeah.
Is that the administration's position or yours?
There isn't a position on this any more than there's a position on the temperature at which water boils.
The administration, your administration.
And don't forget, I need you to
supports wind and
stretch
solar,
40.
clean coal, nuclear power, raising fuel economy standards, and building a more efficient electrical grid.
Yes.
And?
That would have been great.
Let's see if we can't find a better spin. People are starting their weekends. The report says we can release 565 more gigatons of CO2 without the effects being
It
calamitous.
says we can only release 565 gigatons.
So what if we only release 564?
Well, then we would have a reasonable shot at some form of dystopian post-apocalyptic life. But the carbon dioxide in the oil that we've already leased is 2,795 gigatons. So,
What would all this look like?
well, mass migrations, food and water shortages, spread of deadly disease, endless wildfires, way too many to keep under control. Storms that have the power to level cities, blacken out the sky, and create permanent darkness.
Are you going to get in trouble for saying this publicly?
Who cares?
Mr. Westbrook, we want to inform people, but we don't want to alarm them. Can you give us a reason to be optimistic?
Well, that's the thing, Will. Americans are optimistic by nature. And if we face this problem head on, if we listen to our best scientists and act decisively and passionately, I still don't see any way we can survive.
Okay. Richard Westbrook, Deputy Assistant Administrator of the EPA. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
This is Newsnight. We'll be back right after this.
Just to be clear, I was not consulted before that little clip was produced. 3 things you should know. They, in that episode, only considered carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's it. There's a handful of other greenhouse gases, including methane, completely ignored. They talk about reaching 450 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because that's the new number that we cannot cross. Not that long ago, it was 350 parts per million. Remember the organization 350.org? Well, now we're at 400. If we add on just methane, we're at the carbon dioxide equivalent of 650 parts per million. They only consider carbon dioxide. They don't include methane or the potential for any other greenhouse gas to add heating. Secondly, everything they talked about as potentially occurring in the future, it's already underway. Mass migrations, perhaps you're familiar with people from Northern Africa and the Middle East coming to Europe. Perhaps you're familiar with the small island states in the South Pacific that people are being welcomed into New Zealand. It costs $2 million to get into New Zealand. $2 million American. Or one of a handful of incredibly rare skills. That's what it takes to get into New Zealand. Or your habitat being wiped out because you live in a small island nation in the South Pacific. Mass migrations are underway. Food and water shortages, underway already. 5 million people a year die early deaths because of climate change. We don't see them here because we're privileged people who live in the global north. But, speaking of privileged people living in the global north, how about California, where several thousand people have been without water for the last, more than 8 months because the aquifers dropped so low, there's no recharge occurring, so they don't have water coming through the taps. The wells don't go down deep enough. Food shortages already underway. They're going to get a lot worse. Mass migrations, check. Food and water shortages, check. What else was there? Deadly disease, the spread of deadly disease. Well, because biological activity increases profoundly with a small rise in the low temperature during the winter, because of that, biological activity of ticks, for example, that carry Lyme disease, of other diseases are spreading way, way further from the equator than anybody ever imagined 5 years ago. So spread of deadly diseases, storms that will level cities. Perhaps you heard of the Philippines, Hurricane Sandy, going back to 2005, Hurricane Katrina. So the storms are already underway. The events described as going to occur in the future have occurred in the past. They're going to get much worse. The maximum heating associated with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doesn't occur until 10 years after the release of carbon dioxide. So we haven't even seen the maximum heating associated with carbon dioxide is released over the last 10 years, since 2005, when Katrina hit. We have not yet observed the damage we're going to see as a result of methane spreading around the globe. So at times like this, I feel like George Orwell or Ray Bradbury or Aldous Huxley, all of whom were writing science fiction in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. And each of them, when asked, how can you see such a dystopian future? How can you see and predict into the future? They said, I'm not. I'm describing what's happening today. That you can't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. With respect to abrupt climate change, it's happening. So, what do we do? Well, I have really good news. It wouldn't be very Hollywood-like of me, not very optimistic American of me, would it, to finish the movie without good news? So I have really good news. The good news is you get to die. And that's really incredible. Because it means you get to live. It means we get to, not have to, get to. We get to live. We're here. We get to live. It's astonishing. The odds against that happening are greater than the odds against you purchasing a single lottery ticket every week and winning every week for the rest of your life. Wouldn't that be something? You would never expect that to happen. I would never expect you to happen. Because our knowledge of DNA assures that we're all essentially impossible. And yet here we are. If I wasn't such a hardcore left-brain scientist, I would think each of us was a miracle. But I don't do the miracle thing. I still conclude that we're pretty amazing, that it's pretty amazing, that we get to be here at all, that we get to live is simply astonishing. Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologist, concludes that in the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I that are privileged to be here, privileged with eyes to see where we are and brains to wonder why. Not only do we get to be here, not only do we get to live, but we get to have these enormous brains. We get to have the eyes to look around and see where we are, cosmologically even. We're like right here, a speck on a speck on a speck on a completely irrelevant speck. And yet we're here. It's amazing. We have these big brains, we get to see where we are using incredible technology and conclude that we're essentially impossible. You can spend 15 seconds on a small digital device, so small that it's mind-boggling. It has more computing power than would have filled this room with supercomputers 20 years ago. You can spend 15 seconds with that digital device and you can find out that everything I've said is actually accurate. Not only with respect to the science, but also with respect to the odds against us being here, which are truly cosmological. And yet here we are in physical form. You can spend the next 15 or 20 seconds and go down the road of being here, a speck on a speck on a speck that you're just nothing in the vast of a nothing universe that doesn't care about you at all. Our brains are big enough and complex enough that we can hold in them two ideas simultaneously, that we're a speck on a meaningless, worthless speck that the universe doesn't care about our entire species, much less as individuals, and we're miracles. We're amazing, we're astonishing, we're unique, just like everybody else. That we get to live against cosmological odds. If you ponder that for too long, if you sit underneath a tree with a river going by and leave your digital device aside for a while so there's nothing bothering you, it can make you overwhelmingly joyous and overwhelmingly sad within seconds or minutes of each other. I would encourage all of that. I suspect that when we go into the abyss, among the last things we will say is, I should have bought more crap. We think we're so important. We think our own individual lives are so important, and we measure success in all the wrong ways. Mostly we do it monetarily. And yet, it's difficult for me to imagine more than a handful of people in the history of the planet experiencing as their final thoughts, oh man, I'm so miserable, and yet I would have been so happy if I'd have just got to go to that one extra movie before I died. If I would have just got 74 more pair of shoes. If I would have got my third really nice car. We aren't built like that. We aren't wired like that. Yes, we're evolutionarily programmed for flight or fight, for immediate survival, for procreation, to make little copies of ourselves, and then to accumulate material possessions. Yes, we got all that going on because at some point in the distant past, some guy walked out of the cave with a rock in his hand, and he didn't really know why, but when he showed up and there was a saber-toothed cat in front of him, he looked at the rock and he looked at the cat, and he was able to survive a little bit longer because he had the rock. And he went back and he says, I need more rocks. And so that's us, right? Accumulating rocks, accumulating gold and diamonds, accumulating these things that in the cosmological sense, in the individual sense at the end of our days, have very little bearing on how joyful we are. Not only does evolution drive us in that direction, but culture really piles on. Perhaps you're familiar with the expression, keeping up with the Joneses. Interestingly, when James Truslow Adams popularized the term the American Dream in his 1931 book, he talked about the American Dream as being something accessible for all, that the idea was not, explicitly not, to keep up with the Joneses, to have more than others have. The American Dream was socialism, really, that everybody should have enough. We veered a little bit from that path in the recent decades. So, what to do then? What to do if our lives are short? I think it's safe to assume that we have somewhere between 18 months and 20 years left of human habitat on the planet. So what to do in this one short life? That, by the way, was pretty much guaranteed to be short, even if I'm wrong, even if all the climate scientists are wrong. What I propose we do is pursue a couple of things. Love, and what we love, and lives of excellence. I don't know what that means for you, either one, really. I know what pursuing a life of excellence means for me, but it took me a long time to get there. I had to read a lot of ancient philosophy. I suspect had I just consumed ayahuasca when I was 18, I would have cut off a whole bunch of reading philosophy and a little bit of meditation. So I don't know what it means for you to pursue a life of excellence. I know what it means for me. It means asking questions of this utterly insane culture and expecting no particular responses in return, but at least being able to ponder those questions. Because like you, I'm in a position of enormous privilege. On a daily basis, I don't have to worry about freezing to death at night. On a daily basis, I don't have to worry about where my food is going to come from. On a daily basis, I don't have to worry about water coming through the taps. If I had to spend 8 or 10 hours each day walking to a river and bringing back the 2 or 3 gallons of water I was going to use that day, then I wouldn't be in such a position of privilege. I wouldn't be able to ponder the questions that I think are existentially important and always have been. Maybe for you, excellence means gardening. Maybe it means journalism. Maybe it means any number of things. But I don't know that. I don't know you that well. I barely know myself. I do think, however, that if all the climate scientists have been bought off by those big green organizations like the World Wildlife Fund to make things look even worse than they are, I still know that our lives are short and that our run as a species will be short. Even if we persist several thousand more years, we will still have less time as a species, 1/7 the amount of time of the typical species of mammal. And it will be a stunningly short period of time from a cosmological perspective. Sometimes people ask me, no, they don't ask me, they ask other people, what if he's wrong? More frequently, people just state it as a statement with an exclamation mark on the end, he's wrong. And it could be that everything I've presented is incorrect. It could be that the science I'm quoting is wrong. It could be that the models and the data and the assessments and the forecasts are all wrong. The International Energy Agency in May of last year concluded that business as usual leads to up to a 6°C temperature rise, global average, by 2050. So Paul Beckwith's forecast of a 5 or 6 degree temperature rise in 1 or 2 decades isn't that bizarre, considering that the International Energy Agency doesn't include methane or any other self-reinforcing feedback loops in their analysis. So even if we make it till 2050, even if civilization holds on till 2050 and we maintain business as usual, and we only consider carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because for some reason the other greenhouse gases don't matter anymore, even if we make it till then, 2050 is not very long. What if I'm wrong? I still have amazingly, astonishingly good news. We still get to die. Somebody suggested we Photoshop my face into that thing. I thought that was going a little too far. When I was in California on tour recently, somebody suggested calling the whole tour the Grim Reaper Comedy Club Climate Hour. That would be the name of the whole tour. Because we still get to die. It's a get to kind of thing. We still get to live. We get to live. It's amazing when you think about it. It's amazing even if you don't think about it, by the way, because I'm thinking about it for you. It's amazing that we get to be here not only at all in physical form. There's not just that. We're here at the most incredible time in human history. The end. It's a movie and everybody else walked out. But we stayed till the end. We get to see how it turns out. Okay, that might be putting a little too positive spin on it. I used to say that no matter how long you live, even if you live to be 100, it's not going to seem like very long. Well, the world's oldest person turned 117 in early March, just about 6 or 7 weeks ago. And when asked about the first 117 years of her life, she says, it seemed rather short. 117 years. Maybe it's because she couldn't remember things very well, right? You get to be that old. It seemed rather short. But I suspect it's because it seems rather short. Consistent with my message that birth is lethal, that nobody gets out alive, she died a couple of weeks ago. See, even if you live to be 117, 1, you don't live forever, and 2, it seems rather short. We get to live. Live. if you want more, and how could you not? All the data and then some are presented in this essay, guymcpherson.com/climate-chaos. And the data and more appear in my latest book, co-written with Carolyn Baker, Extinction Dialogues. We get to live. And in that, there's enormous power. We not only get to influence how we live, but most of us get to influence a relatively small group of people around us too. Some people maybe even more. In the end, what we have are a few memories that we take into the abyss. And with luck, those memories are positive. They're the times we remember that we brought joy to ourselves and others. I really doubt anybody in this room is going to have their last thought be, I should have bought more crap, in any form. Rather, I suspect that we're going to remember a few things. I'd be willing to bet that nobody in this room can remember 3 minutes in a row of what I said tonight. But I hope you're going to remember the message. We get to live, and in the process, we get to help others live too. Kurt Vonnegut, when asked the question, why are we here, always gave one of two responses. He gave the response he got from his son Mark after Mark was released from an insane asylum and before he completed his medical degree at Harvard Medical School. Kurt Vonnegut said in response to the question, why are we here? We are here to help each other through this, whatever this is. And sometimes Kurt Vonnegut would quote his uncle too, who said, we're here to fart around and don't let anybody tell you any different. So I suspect somewhere between those two, or maybe including those two, that's the reason I'm here. I'm here to help each other through this, whatever this is, to come to grips with what I consider reality, and to live with urgency. That's what it means to live with death in mind, is to live with urgency, to treat each moment as if it matters, because it does. To treat each memory as if it matters, and to hold on to those moments of joy and create them along the way, because they matter too. We have this enormous power in our hands, the ability to influence ourselves and the relatively few people around us. It's not just power, it's an honor and a privilege and a joy as well. Thank you.